if we take this to the classroom and have a look at mixed ability teaching, and then we'll now link this to what we've been talking about to do with dyslexia. Mixed ability teaching takes place when you have learners of different abilities who are taught in the same class group using mixed ability strategies. And as Bremner rightly points out, it's really very easy to assume when you hear mixed ability groups, it's easy to assume that, all right, it's a mixed ability group. That means that the mixed ability teaching is taking place. This is not necessarily the case. In fact, if anything, although I do not have research statistics, it can be rightly assumed that when you speak to mainstream teachers who teach mixed ability groups, they do not necessarily use mixed ability strategies. And therefore, it does not follow that being in a mixed ability group ensures that a learner experiences mixed ability teaching. And that, of course, is something that needs to be redressed. Because when you have learners of different abilities in the same group, so you have your high flyers, if you like, gifted and talented, whatever you might call them, you have the middle group, and then, of course, you have the group that might have, for example, differences to do with social and cognition and learning needs, or any other type of need. Where their needs are not met, then a secondary disability could actually develop, which now exacerbates their educational experience even further. In general, teachers tend to teach to the middle group, and so you also have your high flyers or your gifted and talented learners, your more able learners, also experiencing some kind of frustration and probably showing secondary differences as well. And therefore, when mixed ability takes place, mixed ability teaching takes place, or when you have a mixed ability group, it is really crucial that teachers of mixed ability groups understand the importance of mixed ability teaching strategies and use them. Now, earlier on, I mentioned the plasticity of the brain and the possibility also. I also mentioned that where there are problems with phonological awareness, which is characteristic of dyslexia, remedial strategies can actually take place. Mello and Gabrielli talk about remedial strategies which can be used, for example, as a few hours a day, explicit, systematic, intensive instruction in phonological awareness can be provided for individual learners, which would help them to develop those skills of recognizing phonemes and being able to name them appropriately. And because of the plasticity of the brain, this helps to develop their visual word form area, which of course could be underdeveloped, which is the reason why they're finding it hard to make the link between the sounds and the print, or in between the phonemes and the graphemes. And so remedial strategies will help to bring these learners closer to having a typical reading network structure and function. But it's also important to note that learners who have dyslexia also experiencing other differing factors. So, for example, a learner may have dyslexia and other needs, which is comorbidity, or the language that they speak. It's because, of course, we're talking in English, and when we talk about dyslexia, sometimes we assume that dyslexia only happens with English language, but of course it doesn't. It happens across languages, wherever a language is spoken. And the relationship in between that language and print, between sound and print in that language, has implications for dyslexia. When you look at your multilingual learners, Mello and Gabrielli refer to bilingualism, but I prefer multilingualism because, as we know, you have more multilingual learners possibly than bilingual learners, and multilingualism covers bilingual learners anyway. And of course, within these languages, again, the learner will have their first language, second language, other languages. What is the relationship in between sound and print? Mello and Gabrielli identify what a very important point. They talk about transparent and opaque languages. And so you have languages that have a consistent relationship in between a sound and the print. So languages like Spanish, for example, where they have a rule and they consistently follow that rule. But if you look at languages like English, they see languages like English are referred to as opaque languages, and that is because there's an inconsistent relationship in between the sound and the print. If we look, for example, like a word like rough, R-O-U-G-H, which of course ends in a f sound. However, when we look at the typical print of that f sound, it's not found anywhere in the word rough. You might find the f sound, for example, in fish, right at the start, or any other language starting with a letter that we call F. However, you get that f sound, which is the sound that the letter F makes. You hear it in the word rough, that printed word, but you certainly do not see that letter there. And so that's an opaque language because there's an inconsistent relationship in between the sounds and the printed form of that sound. And interestingly enough, as we would expect, learners with dyslexia actually find these words easier to read because they do not have to make that phonological connection in between the sound and the print. And this, I think, also throws up arguments about phonic approaches to teaching reading. There are people, name doesn't come to mind now, but will come in a minute. Strong advocates of whole word reading, where you just learn to recognize a printed word rather than have to make a connection in between the sounds and that print. But that's a different argument. And then, of course, fourthly, socioeconomic status, of course, is also important when you're dealing with dyslexic learners. And so, in schools need to recognize the difference between reading ability and dyslexia. Again, they are two different things. Of course, they are related because a person with dyslexia would have their reading ability impaired. However, a person can develop compensatory behaviors, which is what I mentioned earlier on when we were looking at the role of the IF, the inferior frontal cortex, because there are activities that take place in that space, in that left part of the brain, where the learner can actually develop compensatory behaviors which help to increase their reading ability. Dyslexia always remains, it's not going to change, but the brain being the plasticity of the brain is not plastic, plasticity of the brain, of course, enables that learner over time to be able to develop those parts that are needed in terms of the structure and the functions required for reading. And so strategies for reading instruction and remediation may suit some dyslexics. However, that's not to say that they will suit all. So differentiation, those strategies that we put in place to meet the needs of dyslexic learners, needs to be personalized. And I agree that is quite a challenge in a mainstream school where you have 30 students or more. Well, if we're talking about African students, definitely you have a lot more than 30. African schools, sorry. You now have to plan lessons, for individuals or plan remediation for individuals. And so definitely there will need to be some kind of whole school approach there and some kind of specialists, provision for specialists to come in and ensure or make opportunities for this differentiation to take place. So we've had a look at what neuroscience tells us about what dyslexia is. We've had a look at what mixed ability teaching is and those issues to do with meeting the needs of all the learners within the class. And of course, Hanks 2011 gives some useful classroom strategies that tutors can use. So tutors, for example, can provide clear, legible, readable writing on their whiteboard or their blackboard with clear spacing between words and sentences. This helps the learners to identify where words begin and end, which is really important when you are struggling to develop connections with printed words. Also the use of color coding as well. So if you have a concept, if you're talking about 2 or 3 different concepts in your teaching, but you color code all the areas to do with each concept. So blue runs along with everything to do with rivers, for example, and green runs along with everything to do with vegetation. If you were, for example, you were teaching geography, again, it will help the learners to make those visual connections in between those concepts. Also talking in short sentences. So we remember, you might recollect when we're looking at the IF, it deals with verbal working memory. And of course, working memory is temporary. You give an instruction, open your books, get out your pencils, turn to page 49 in your geography textbook and look, and then a number of instructions are given all at once. For learners who might have underactivation in their IF, it's unlikely that they will be able to remember a long string of instructions. And so delivering information in short sentences will enable them to know what they're meant to do and to keep up. And students who do not have issues in their IF will be able to cope anyway. Using diagrams and illustration helps a lot because the learners are not having to deal with the printed word as of that point in time, and therefore it will enhance their understanding. And also having space either in the textbooks or the handouts to annotate, because of course the dyslexic learners will compensate. They will look for other strategies in order to remember what they're being taught. And so if there's space, for example, within the handout you have given them to create mnemonics that they might use, or whatever idea or word that they're associating what you're saying with, to be able to write that in that place so that they can now make that connection. Quiet environment, because when you're having to do all of this, you do not need distraction. And where possible, avoid copying from the board. Again, in many of our African schools, there is a lot of writing on the board, a lot of chalk and talk. And I do understand that resourcing is a genuine issue in many schools worldwide. And the quickest and I think most cost-efficient way, of course, is write notes on the board and students copy them down. But when you're dealing with learners with dyslexia and even other cognition and learning difficulties or other types of special educational need, it's unlikely that they are going to learn or cope with writing extensively from the board. And so if some time can be taken to design worksheets or even buy commercially made ones if the resources are available, they would have that worksheet to hand. They will be able to now engage with explanations or activities or discussion that would embed their understanding of what is written in the worksheet. Another thing that learners will benefit from is more time for their tasks, time to redraft and proofread. If they have to read during the lesson, the use of a reading slope so that the book is placed at an angle rather than flat on a desk. If they're reading online, text-speech software is very useful because that would read alongside the learner. Or if they're reading silently, text-speech software will do the reading and they'll be able to make those connections as they are listening to the text speech. When it comes to the emotional and social aspect of learning, of course, it will not make sense to ask a dyslexic to read out loud in front of others, because that runs counter to the whole purpose of education and teaching and learning. Unless, of course, a dyslexic learner volunteers or wants to read out in front of others. And even then, educating others as well to be mindful of other people's differences or disabilities, because at the end of the day, when you leave school, you're still all going to live in the same society. So recognizing, tolerating, respecting differences is also something that can be learnt through this simple action of either choosing to read out loud or not reading out loud in front of others. And of course, as a teacher, feedback needs to motivate learners to read more. And so when the marking is overcritical so that every single mistake is picked on and corrected, that can sometimes be counterproductive to developing a motivated learner. There are various other things, for example, spell checkers, voice dictionaries, when the student wants to write an essay, to use a mind map. And so these are just a few of what Hanks has to say about engaging dyslexic learners in the class. And another thing, just as a sort of way of bringing this to a close, is for the teacher to give a preview of the lesson at the start, so that all the learners have an idea. We're looking at 4 concepts today, and these are what the 4 concepts are. So your dyslexic learner, for example, who might have probably engaged with 2 of the concepts, would know there are 2 more concepts for me to learn. I haven't learned 4 concepts today. And so giving a preview of the lesson at the start also helps them, and a summary at the end, so the learner will be able to identify what they might have missed in the course of the lesson. Using multisensory methods as well, which feed into practical opportunities. Definitely in my, coming up to almost 4 decades of teaching now, I believe strongly that there is no topic that cannot be made practical. Yes, some topics do lend themselves closer to a practical application than others, but when you're in the class and you're face-to-face and you're hands-on, there are immense opportunities for making whatever it is that you're teaching practical. And so reducing or avoiding chalk and talk and planning in such a way that your learners can engage practically in what they're doing can also help your dyslexics or other learners with cognition and learning needs to engage and begin to understand and develop that motivation, which will pay off later when they become very much a part of the class rather than feel sidelined. And it also helps the other learners as well. Providing resources such as reading rulers helps dyslexics, particularly those who have scotopic sensitivity, which is an oversensitivity to light. And of course, what the reading rulers do is harness and reduce the excess, if you like, light that the learners find distractive. Of course, a non-dyslexic learner or a typical learner would not experience this. Maintain literacy support, and also the use of testing to progress and motivate, rather than, it's good to feedback. So if a student hasn't got everything, is not where they should be, but it's how the tests are used and fed back to the learner, which is a difference between the learner carrying on and the learner giving up. So that's sensitive use. So just to bring all these ideas together, what we've done is we've explored an overall categorization of special educational needs relating to cognition and learning. And we've gone a bit further, a bit deeper into dyslexia as an example of a specific cognition and learning need, looking at its definition, its history, a neuroscientific explanation, thanks to Mello and Gabrielli and their beautifully accessible article, and also what Hanks has had to say about what can be done. Simple, common sense strategies, I think, of what can be done in the classroom. And I hope that this provides a better understanding of what we need to do to meet the learners with the needs of learners with dyslexia in the class. I hope that you found this webinar useful, and of course we have a few more coming up in this series and a number of other series as well. So do keep watching our Delta TV channel and comment, subscribe, like, and share the links with your fellow educators. And hopefully together we can make a difference to teaching and learning in our African schools. Thank you for listening.